and I'll make it just very, very quick. Sian Wilson is an associate professor in community psychology at Wilfrid Laurier, and we've heard a lot of your students in the room. And she's the co-director of the Center for Community Research, Learning, and Action. Sian is of Afro, Indo, Euro, Jamaican ancestry. That's quite a wonderful introduction. And so her topic is research is community-based action for Black and Indigenous lives. And I don't know if people followed the links that I sent, but they're amazing videos from her programs. So I'm very happy to turn it over to Sian. And if people are able and to stay 10 minutes later, we can give her the full hour. So whoever can will go. Is that going to be a problem, Jean? Jean's left. Okay. We'll assume it's not a problem. All right. Turning it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom. And can I be made the host so I can actually share my screen? Or let me just see if I can actually do that with that.
You can do it.
Okay, perfect. Let's see if this works. And you can let me know if you see what I'm looking at.
Yep.
Perfect. I'm just going to increase this, and you can let me know, the folks who are watching, if I need to blow up the screen a little bit more, or if that works for you in terms of visibility.
That's great. No, there it is.
Okay. So I'll as I told Tom earlier, I'm totally open to individuals who may have questions throughout. So Tom will be keeping an eye on people who use the raise hand function to engage in questions or just have any conversational points that they'd like to make about anything that's being said in the presentation. So I'm going to talk through the Proclaiming Our Roots project a little bit and share with you the work that I've been immersed in with Black and Indigenous communities here in Canada in particular. This work is also, I mean, there are many Indigenous Black groups that are doing this work in the United States as well, in places like Florida and Louisiana and California. So there's definitely a sweltering of a movement of folks that do very similar work, whether through nonprofits or that sort of thing. And so this work is really coming out of a research project that I had initiated. But before I sort of formally begin, I kind of wanted to give a little bit of sort of acknowledgement to the space in which I do this work. So as I mentioned, while I'm squarely based in Canada, I wanted to acknowledge that, Canada is a part of Turtle Island, and Turtle Island is what describes what some Indigenous groups use to describe larger North American context, which stretches from present-day Mexico all the way up to present-day Canada, including the Caribbean I'm from. And so just sort of highlighting when I say Turtle Island, that particular term, many Indigenous communities do regard the North American continent as Turtle Island, and there's a lot of creation stories that inform why that name in terms of Turtle Island. And I currently sit and am presenting to you on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people, which are the historical stewards, Indigenous stewards of the territory in which I'm presenting here in Southern Ontario. And the work that and you'll see the work that I do, spans across Canada, and so from several different Indigenous territories of several different tribes and groups across Canada. Another thing to note is that Canada alone is home to over 6 Indigenous nations or tribes, speaking over 53 different languages, and that's only Canada. So I can only imagine if we included Mexico and present-day the United States and the Caribbean, how many more languages and histories and traditions that would include. I'm also going to just ask if folks can mute their mics if they're not speaking. That would be greatly appreciated because I can hear all of the feedback, so that would be greatly appreciated. So really quickly, because I do realize that many of you are in the audience are working and living within the American context, and it's always important to uniformly talk about language. I also wanted to define what I'm talking about when I say Indigenous and Black communities. So in Canada, we use the term original or
Cian, you
Oh, sorry. Sorry, did you hear any of what I said?
not from the start of the definitions page.
Okay,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. Yeah, not sure why that muted. So I was just remarking that in Canada, we use the term Indigenous to signify people who are the first peoples of this territory. So you might regard folks as Native Americans. That's a pretty common, I think, term used in the United States. In Canada, we regard folks as Indigenous to the community. So the first peoples of North America, who fall into three larger groups: First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. And as I mentioned, those are three larger groups that oversee, again, hundreds of tribes and, several dozens of languages. And then when I use the term Black or African Caribbean and Black, or ACB, African Caribbean and Black, I'm referring to African diasporic communities that have lived in this continent, whether it be hundreds of years. In some cases, that we have traced trading routes to thousands of years between Indigenous folks here in North America and Indigenous folks of the African continent. But really specifically talking about Black identified individuals with varying histories across North America, depending on where we are. As you can probably anticipate, the histories of Black folks from Mexico all the way up to Canada looks very different. It's very varied and diverse, and so fully acknowledging the full sort of Black diaspora. For me, the reason that I do this work, one is my own history and heritage, being from the larger Turtle Island, the Caribbean specifically, as Tom talked about in his introduction. But also, for me, there's a lot of historical and contemporary connections between African diasporic and Indigenous communities, and I'll talk through some of those as we go through the presentation here today. But there's a lot of connections between these communities, and also, again, the connections between, even if we look at the enslavement trade and what that meant, there's a lot of significance in sort of the dragging, so to speak, and stealing of continental African peoples, who literally fuel the ships that then bring Europeans to North America, where they then exploit other Indigenous people. So there's these very important connections between Indigenous peoples of the continent and Indigenous folks here in terms of their relationship to colonization in a really particular way. And as you'll see in some of the slides to follow, I'll sort of unpack that a little bit. One thing that I will note is I'm not sure if we'll have an opportunity to share the video specifically in this presentation, just because I'm not sure how that works over Zoom and how volume works. We'll see how it goes, but I'm not really sure if the videos will screen well. But I'll talk a little bit through the project. So again, how I come to be here is by route of the island of Jamaica. And as you can see, there's lots of, cultural symbolisms that harken on our Indigenous history in the Jamaican, national symbols, such as the coat of arms, which is this item right here in the center here with these two Indigenous Arawak figures that sort of signify Jamaica's Indigenous history as well. We also know that some of our words and our customs and our cultures and our foods, as well as some of our communities across the island, are deeply seated in their Indigenous practice, whether that be a mishmash of Indigenous Black practices or Indigenous Native practices to the island. And so, that also is a part of my own history that gives light to the way in which I framed this work that I'm engaged in and the work that I do. So the Proclaiming Our Roots project in particular, I wanted to showcase the art, which really comes from one of our Indigenous Black artists here, our local artists, Melissa Watson, who created this. And what they really wanted to do was create an artistic output that really captured, Indigenous culture as well as African culture. So you'll see the Kenyan shield behind the buffalo, which has very important significance for Indigenous communities in the prairies specifically. You'll also see intermeshed within the body of the bison the continents of North America and Africa in the actual outline of the body there. If you look really carefully, Melissa also wanted to work with the colors of black and red and yellows. Again, colors with significance in our respective cultures. And so even in from the very creation of the artwork of the project, we really wanted to intermesh some really culturally relevant pieces that spoke to the cultures and histories and origins of the two communities that we are working with. Of course, no project really takes flight and really is successful without an entire team of people. And so I could not do this work and would not have been as successful as we have been with this work if we didn't have this entire remarkable team of people. Sarah Flicker, who was my co-investigator on this particular project, Anique Jordan, who is right here. Anique was our artist facilitator who facilitated the creation of all of the digital stories, and she does a lot of really great arts-based work across Ontario and Canada more generally. Anne-Marie Beals, who's an Indigenous Black woman or person, I should say. Anne-Marie identifies as Two-Spirit, and so goes by the pronouns of they, them. And so Anne-Marie is based out of, comes out of Halifax, Nova Scotia, or Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, more specifically, on the east coast of Canada. And they brought their expertise, lived experience to the project, which was really amazing to work with them on the project. Denise Baldwin on the right corner, top corner here, also an Indigenous Black woman who was my partner in crime on this project. We conceptualized this project from the outset because Denise really wanted a space for Indigenous Black people to be able to express their lived realities and experiences. Beneath Denise's picture is Rashida Simons, also from Nova Scotia. Our on-the-ground person there in terms of bookings and organizing, and so our on-the-ground community member. And then last but not least, Dr. Benita Lawrence, another faculty on this project. Benita is a Mi'kmaq scholar based out of York University in Ontario, and her work has focused on Black and Indigenous solidarity and allyship historically. And so this has been the compromising of the team. This is what it's comprised of. And again, you really don't build a project like this without amazing people and a host of folks. In terms of the scholarship that informs this work, intersectionality, a really important concept that informs the work that we are working with, especially because we're working with individuals that cut across varying communities. They're queer identified, they're Indigenous, they are Black identified, and so really looking at the concept of intersectionality through and through in terms of the communities that we're working with, and also communities that are dealing with intersectional, forms of and types of issues, everything from, poverty to cultural reclamation to sovereignty to anti-Black racism. So all of those issues really were, imbued in the community, in the complexity of the communities that we were working with, and the issues that we were cutting across in sort of the stories that were highlighted. And so a really important concept for this work. Another really important concept that builds, that sort of, it influences and inspires a social determinants of health model is, of course, an Indigenous health systems model. And so you can see a lot of symbolism between this, the connection of the self to the body, mind, and spirit, to community, to, housing and more sort of like structural well-being things, to our ecological model, of course, in psychology, and a social determinants of health model. I view the ecological model and the social determinants of health model as the mainstream version of what Indigenous peoples the world over have always known, that these things are intimately interconnected. And so this is sort of like the white dude's version, the public version that is talked about, but these are not new concepts for us as Indigenous peoples around the world. In terms of the objectives of the Proclaiming Our Roots project, we have three main objectives here: to gain an understanding of the forms of violence and erasure that mixed Indigenous and Black people faced across Canada, and in particular, our resources allowed us to collect data from communities in Toronto, which is of course the big sort of economic hub of Canada, and Halifax, which is the location of a historically Black community community, Black loyalists that came up out of course, the wars of the 1800s and settled in Halifax in a really specific way, and even folks that settled before that. So Black loyalist settlements. There are roughly, I think, 40 to 50,000 Black Nova Scotians in and around the Halifax area, and so we wanted to gather both historically as well as more recent migration and capture Blackness in its full sort of diversity and spectrum in the Canadian context. Another big objective to situate the lived experiences of Indigenous and Black people within Canada's call for truth and reconciliation. So for anyone who's not familiar, the Canadian government, had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission create a report about the ways in which essentially the brutality of the cultural loss of Indigenous folks and the clear sort of white settler violence that has been very instrumental in sort of erasing Indigenous culture in Canada. So they wanted to, so the TRC comes out of Indigenous peoples, really centering those issues and naming Canada's brutal history of colonization and at that time, there were, what we wanted to do was also make sure that Indigenous Black people were a part of those conversations, that they were included in those conversations, that they were not thought of as somehow separate because of the really rife anti-Blackness that is, I think present in some of these conversations when it comes to Indigenous identity. And lastly, to create a visual and written archive of the realities and experiences of Indigenous Black communities in the larger Canadian context. So these were some of the big objectives of this particular project. I'm going to pause for a minute just to see if there are any questions or thoughts or anything at all from the floor.
Unmute yourself.
So this is Vernita. Hi, Cian.
Hi, Maria.
So I just had a question on the Venn diagrams from the previous slide. Just asking if this is the people first, community, family, and self. If it's that Indigenous macrocosm, I'm not getting the correct word. But it applies to that, yes?
Sorry, so could you repeat the question?
So my understanding in my Indigenous groups is that the general concept of Indigenous belief system is people first, which is what I guess a colonized terminology is global, and then comes community, and then comes family and self.
Oh, I see. So you're asking, is that similar in the way in which this is conceptualized here? I would say that it's a little bit different in the sense that while the self is at the center of this model in a sort of like a very literal sense, the way in which a lot of Indigenous communities that I've spoken with and who sort of talked through these issues, there's always the centering of the community first, because the whole is really, really instrumental and really important and imperative to the self and to the collective good and to the larger sort of system and ecosystem of the community at large. And so I would almost want to say that the community is kind of, or the collective is centered, and relationships are centered in a really particular way that I don't think is necessarily always the case with more Western models, which puts the self really squarely at the pinnacle of all of this.
Yeah, I think we're kind of saying the same thing, and I can do offline conversations with you in more depth about this, but I was just trying to understand it. So yes, what you're saying is what I understand then. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Any other questions or thoughts on the floor? Okay, so I'll keep it moving and we'll pause again at another opportune moment. But I wanted to also showcase where we gathered data from. So geographically for folks who aren't in the know. So Ontario, Southern Ontario, Toronto, and Halifax were our major sites. We also gathered one story from the Winnipeg area. So this just showcased geographically across Canada, where did these stories come from? Where were these individuals living? So just to showcase to you where we're talking about. So again, Halifax is over here in the East Coast, which is where the historically Black settled settlements have been, very connected to the Louisianas and the Florida region in terms of the Black history and the Black communities there. And then, of course, in Southern Ontario, and then a story out here in Winnipeg. And in terms of the methods that we employed, so digital storytelling was a key one. So personal videos of experience, layering text and image and voice and sound. I really hope I'm able to share at least one of those with you today, but I won't, again, it'll depend on what Zoom is willing to cooperate with. But we do have the website. And so I'm also going to encourage folks to go and check out the website and the stories via our YouTube page and our website. Community mapping. So this is an example of a community map here where folks could actually plot the different regions from, North America and the world that their family histories are tied to. And when you click on each of these little dots on the website, you actually get a little bit more of more information and a story about, the participants in this study. And that sort of locates their family history in some text as well. We also conducted individual semi-structured interviews at the end of our digital storytelling workshops. And then, we had, we audio recorded all of the group dialogue sessions. So in between our workshops of creating these digital stories, there was lots of group breakout sessions where we would just have great conversation about how the digital storytelling process was going, the challenges, what people were experiencing as they were rehashing some of their lived experiences, and that those group dialogue sessions were also audio recorded and were also part of the data collection process for us in this larger workshop. For those who might be really interested in methods, I'm going to pause here just in case there are any questions about methods.
Hi, Cian. I'm very interested in the digital storytelling as a method. Can you either after this or drop in the chat provide like some resources or references where I could get more information about that method?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what I can do is definitely get some resources together for you afterwards. I'm not sure. I think the actual website has been shared, but I'll share that again as well with folks, just so you have that. It's also in the slide deck that was shared, so you will see proclaimingourroots.com really clearly indicated there. But absolutely, I can share with you some digital storytelling resources to check out. Any other methods questions? Okay, so we'll keep it pushing. So after we conducted and gathered these wonderful stories and started to create etch out our community map, which was collaboratively created with the participants, we then wanted to share this wonderful output with the communities themselves. So we went back to Toronto, to the Toronto community. We went back to the Halifax community, and we had these community launches. So we launched, these videos into the ethos. The website was launched around the same time. So you can see here, Toronto, we had our launch on July 31st, and then Dartmouth, it was August 22nd. We also went to Halifax. So Halifax and Dartmouth are two different cities in Nova Scotia in the East Coast there. One is a central sort of like city spot, Halifax is, and Dartmouth is where all the Black folks are. So we wanted to make sure we got our full coverage of the folks who were in the urban center as well as the folks in the more Black centered space. And so we had two launches in Nova Scotia in particular. And these launches were a really great space just to share the outputs with a larger community of people beyond just our participants, but also to their family and friends and people who just really wanted to come and bask in the wonderful stories that were created from members of their community, and learn a little bit maybe about their history and the region, the history of the region and the city that they're living in. Another really important thing that I have to point out, because it was so instrumental and such an important sort of a part of our process, was in the Halifax and Nova Scotia workshop when we were creating these digital stories in Nova Scotia. The location that was booked for us by our local community leader, who booked a community space, they had no option in terms of finding community spaces to book this kind of work, but in a space that was on the grounds of the Black residential school, the historically Black residential school, or the Nova Scotia home of colored children. And so this was a residential school where Black kids went to specifically, unsupervised by their parents. They lived in this space. There was lots of different kinds of abuses, as you can imagine. And Canada has a very dirty history of residential school systems, as I'm sure the US probably has very similar histories. The torture and the torment of what residential school systems were comes out of, again, the indentured camps within South Africa and, Nazi Germany. So very similar sort of torture tactics were used in different places around the world. And this was an encampment where Black kids would go to, and Indigenous Black kids would go to this school, and there would be abuses. They would be, supervised by adults that were not their parents or not their family members. And lots of abuses and lots of really, horrific things happened there. And I got to tell you, it was a really surreal experience to have a workshop where there were no other community spaces that folks could except for the community space on a ground so this house was literally in the backyard of the community space that we were in. And to have this really, I think, really personal sort of sharing space that we were creating that was really instrumental for propelling us forward, but literally looking in the backyard and seeing this building that has this horrific sort of, history for a lot of the community members, if not directly, certainly by their parents and their grandparents had, particular experiences here in this sort of house of horrors of sorts. And it also highlights a larger history of Canada's residential school systems with Indigenous communities more broadly, and of course, Black and Indigenous communities in a really specific way. And so I would be remiss to not mention that in terms of some of the context in which this work happens and happened, just out of the lack of access to other community spaces that were more accessible or, or more usable and friendly potentially, right? And that's a part of the ugly history, but I think it's an important part of that story. So this is our website, proclaimingourroots.com. As I mentioned, you can Google us right now and find us online. And there you will see the digital story tab and our community mapping tab, and you can check us out and see the outputs of some of this and a little bit more about the project you can learn from there. And so definitely check us out in terms of the stories that were created. But the website was a really important thing that we wanted. We wanted a way to share these stories, internationally and across geography, space, and time, given that we wanted something that was, that had longevity, that wasn't just a one-time, one-off project, but that had reach. And so that was the intention and the impetus behind creating a website. Now I'm going to attempt to play Rashida's video. I don't know how this is going to go, but let's see if it does do anything. Possibly not. And I'm going to see how the volume is. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. You can always go to the website to see more. But let's see how this works. Can you please let me know if you can hear it as well?
My name is Rashida Simons, and this is Roots and Rivers. Ancestors have traveled to connect with me over oceans, lands, ley lines, and timelines. Through all the conditions, they were always there. There is a tree that sits above a stream. Its roots are partially removed from the earth, but exist in air and over water, truly in spirit. The whispers of my mother's mother, Nature walks in the forest. She taught me the beauty of trees. Berries in the field, actual life skills to survive. What to eat, what to avoid. Natural remedies, feeling alive in my culture. Indigenous things, and I was a child of the earth. His mother was a copper-skinned woman with silky black hair, cloud-colored to be deeply melanated, dark-skinned, black, African ancestry, led to me making books like boats, resting on ancient civilizations, monuments, Choco Zulu, Jamaican names, Wahisi, Queen Luzinga, Lumumba, and Karenga. Black Panthers, and Viola.
Oops.
Charles Drew, Richard Preston, Carrie Best, Alice Flynn.
Can folks hear that, or is it muffled for anyone? It's good?
No, no, badly muffled.
Yeah.
Okay, it is muffled.
Yeah, it was beautiful to see those. So
Okay, so I'll pause there because I'm seeing the messages come in that it's muffled. So what I will encourage folks to do is to go to the website and check out these videos. They are so amazing, and folks put a lot of really hard work into to creating their videos and sharing these stories. So I will pause there just because I'm getting the messages that the sound quality is not great through Zoom. So we've learned something. Video no go for Zoom. So whoops, let me just pause that. And we'll go to the next slide. Let's see if I can do that though. Okay, let's try this again. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, let's see here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so a little bit about Black and Indigenous history, just because I think that that's super important to talk a little bit about. A lot of folks, I think, are often surprised that there is a history of Black and Indigenous people across North America. And often that, there are, entire groups and communities of mixed Indigenous and Black people, but there's also been a lot of scholarship on this as well. And so I wanted to point out the book Black Indians by William Lawrence Tate, Katz. You've also got Circe Sturm, Emma LaRocque, rather, that writes on Black freeman communities and Black communities within the Cherokee Nation. Some of the work of Andrew Jolivet, who is an Indigenous Black man out of Louisiana and a scholar out of San Francisco University, writes a lot on Indigenous and Black experiences in North America. But the wealth of this scholarship actually comes from the United States. So it actually comes from where most of you are living. And so there's a wealth of scholarship on these histories. A lot of folks don't know that, in order to survive colonization, these communities have really banded together historically in a really particular ways. There's, I'm not sure if you knew that for example, there was a Black Seminole War of 1812, right? That was probably one of the biggest, on the mainland anyways, anti-colonial fights between Black and Indigenous people to reclaim territory and to reclaim freedom against white colonists. Very similarly, a lot of folks don't know that the Haitian Revolution was actually waged by not just Black folks, but also Indigenous folks as well, through their own ceremonies and their prayers together. That is how they actually combated colonists in Haiti. Very similar to the Wars of St. Vincent. I could go on in terms of the ways in which Indigenous Black people have banded together in order to survive, and in fact have created some of the biggest wars waged against colonists, both in North America as well as in the Caribbean and in other places as well. And so really thinking about that history, which frames this work and frames why this history might be hidden, these realities might be silenced. And because it's not necessarily a success story for colonists to talk about that history. The other thing that Indigenous and Black folks in Canada in a really particular way were really engaged in is, for example, intermarrying. And so intermarriages and relationships were really prolific all and throughout North America. And so, of course, that gives rise to the communities, of course, that I work with in terms of talking about Indigenous and Black history. This is actually some images out of the Jamaican airport in Montego Bay that historicizes and commemorates the history of African and Indigenous peoples, the Taino and the Maroons, as well as some of our patron saints in terms of the work that they were so instrumental to, Nanny Maroon, throughout our history in the Caribbean, just again to showcase the ways in which Indigenous and Black history are so interconnected and so intertwined, not just here in this context, but in other contexts contexts as well. I also wanted to highlight here, both past and present, the different kinds of ways that we banded together. So the painting that you see in the middle here is an image of the Haitian Revolution, again waged by Taino and or Indigenous Taino and African enslaved peoples. You've got throughout history, Black and Indigenous solidarity around issues of sovereignty, Indigenous sovereignty, and anti-Black racism. Really central Muhammad Ali there. And of course, more contemporarily, we've got Black Lives Matter protesters in Toronto that are supporting the Attawapiskat young people who essentially wrote the government to say, we don't have anything out here. We don't have any recreation. We don't have any resources, no job prospects. And you wonder why suicide is such a high rate out here. And so Black Lives Matter Toronto banded together to support the call of those young people to action by the government. And so that is the image that you see there. So again, throughout history, you see a lot of banding together of Indigenous and Black people around really, really, important issues because we are so intimately interconnected, those histories. Another scholar, Canadian scholar, Leanne Simpson, writes quite a bit on Black Lives Matter as an Indigenous scholar and the importance of Indigenous and Black solidarity. And so, again, this work is being done by Black and Indigenous scholars across North America, and some important work is coming out of that. Go to the next slide there. So, what's the impact of this work? Well, how has this been received? I can tell you, it's been personally, it's been an amazing project. It's been wonderful to be a part of this process, and I'm so honored to be a part of it and to even speak on it. But more than anything, what really is the measure of the success of a project is, what do the participants get out of it, right? And how have they gone on to do amazing and great things? So I will share with you that more recently, I didn't even get to include that here, our Nova Scotia community just got established as a Black Métis community by the Canadian government. They've been identified and acknowledged. We've Isaac, the first name here, unfortunately didn't get to see Isaac's story, and I hope those of you who are interested will go and check out those stories and check out Isaac's story on our website and our YouTube page. But Isaac has also gone into a deliberation process to get his community in Southern Ontario recognized as a Black Métis community of the Ojibwa of the Anderdon is the name of his community. Carson, one of our other participants, his story talks a lot about the fact that due to anti-Black racism and just the violence that he experienced in schools, never did get to finish school, never did learn to read and write. And what Carson has since done after completing this project, he has gone on to finish his education, get his GED, and the project really was this important thing for him to show him. It was a demonstration for him of all that he could do and all of the possibilities. So he's gone on to finish school. Tanya is a beautiful, wonderful artist, a local artist in Nova Scotia, and she, has continued to build on the culture and the history through her art. Larissa is a mover and shaker that has published an article with Huffington Post on the project's impact on her experience as an Indigenous Black woman, and she's also working for government now. And Keisha has gone on to build community in the Toronto area, an arts-based community and arts-based projects. So these are just some of the things that have come out of this project in terms of what's happened with the participants themselves. And these are just some quotes that really, I think, highlight, some of the impact for individual participants of this work in terms of its impact for them specifically. And so, some of the things that participants had to say was that they're really tired of the anti-Black racism. The telling, not being able to get out the things that they've experienced, the impact on their mental health. That was something that folks talked a lot about through and through these processes, often feeling that they're the only ones or very lonely because they felt that they're the only Indigenous Black person in their small, tight-knit community, even in the middle of Toronto, right, which is a huge metropolis for those who aren't aware, with, the greater Toronto area is going on, I think, roughly 6 to 7 million people right now. So even in communities like that can feel quite small when you know, in your school you're the only Indigenous Black person, and you feel you have to choose, this feeling that you have to choose between your two identities, that you can't be both. You have to choose if you're Black. If you look Black and phenotypically Black, you got to choose to be Black. And if you look Indigenous, you got to choose to be that. So, you know, this idea of choosing, and of course the resident anti-Black racism that folks felt was really, really present, even when, you know, really trying to spotlight their Indigenous identity and their culture, and those things. So these are some of what these quotes talk about. Some of the other impact of the work by participants, this project was really transformative and empowering. The space has been a very safe space. It was a safe space, and I felt extremely comfortable. I appreciate the unity and the sense of family that was established. It was just such a great opportunity for Black Indigenous people to come together and just be, and it was just great to have people come up to me and talk and say, "You look like my cousin." Just keep on doing what you're doing, because what you are doing, I think it's very good. And other folks, you know, had all different kinds of sentiments. One of the really, I think, instrumental moments for me was when an elder approached me, and she looked right at me and she says to me, after one of the community launches where we shared the videos with a broader band of people, and she says to me, you know, we've been waiting for you in this project for a really long time. And that was kind of for me the settling moment of like, okay, we're doing good, we're doing the right thing here, and let's keep on doing what we're doing. Essentially, is what that highlighted for me. So that in a nutshell is some of what's come out of the project. In terms of next steps for us, we are, you know, continue to write papers from this work. Some of the papers already you can see are either forthcoming or already published. We also just got recently funded for a second phase of the project, which is amazing. And we continue to, you know, apply to get funding from our national research funders to continue this work and to build upon this work. So the work does continue. And so over the next year, hopefully at some point in the near future, when we're out of COVID lockdown, we'll be able to do the second phase and get together and actually create more amazing stories. And so that's some of the, you know, where we are with our work and what we, you know, would like to establish. And I'll just sort of leave you with this one quote here from one of our Toronto participants. "I'm feeling very grateful. I want to thank you, Sian, and everyone. You know, sometimes shit gets started and shit ends real quick. So I think it's taken a very special, your superpower of keeping it going to the benefit of all of us. So very appreciative of that. And so our goal is to keep it going. These stories are plentiful, and they you know, abound in terms of their application and across the nation, and the rich histories that are there to elucidate. And that's some of what we are focused on in terms of next steps. And so that is the end. So I'll pause here for folks who may have questions or bring up any sort of topic that is relevant from all of your ongoing work.
Beautiful presentation, just gorgeous. So
Yes,
fascinating.
thank you, Sam.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So empowering. So empowering.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that.
So, Sian, can I ask a question? So I'm in the, I just joined actually the Society for Indian Psychologists, which is a US association. And I'm actually also in the Psychology of Women Division 6, which is again also for, and it's for Native American and Alaska Native, but I would, and I'm going to start pushing for seeing more of the Indigenous Black Native story included too, because there's a group called the Melungians near North Carolina. And there's apparently within some Native American communities a complete like colonial lack of memory about this group. And I think it's important also for Black people in America to have another story besides the story of the mass generational kidnapping and enslavement, right? Because that's, in America's viewpoint, that's the only way people of darker color got here. And we'd like to actually make that story accurate. So I think this is fascinating, the multitude communities, Indigenous communities you have in Canada. And I will go to the site, but I also want to know what can we do as psychologists, as people of color, as allies, what can we do to help get your story, your research out to the world and really educate more? Like what can we do? Because I went online a couple of years ago to the public library to get more books about Black and Indigenous, and there's like one book, and the library didn't even have it in their collection. And so I got to recommend it, and here it is 4 years later, and they still haven't gotten it. For Black History Month that we do here in February, they throw a couple of things up, and everybody puts smiles out and says, "Hey, yay, brown power," and then boom, flat. So we never get this story. So how do we do that? How do we access it? What can we do?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. So part of the reason we created this website was precisely for this reason. We wanted to create an online platform that we would build slowly over time. So we've just got more funding, and we plan to build even more. The next phase of our project will add additional stories to that website, as well as create resources and tool guides for even teaching and educating using these videos. Or the community maps, right? And so that was the intention and the vision behind the creation of a website, was having something that could span the globe in terms of its reach, but also be a resource, an archive of these stories. So you couldn't lose them for an increasingly, an increasing generation of folks who don't want to read. It's also a little bit more accessible, right? Potentially in terms of a way to share these stories in a really, I think, intimate way. And so that was the intention. So my goal is to have that website shared. So please do feel free to share the word, spread the word about the work. And also if there are communities, because I know that we've been, individually one-off participants from the larger project have been connecting with communities in the United States who are doing similar work. So even the congealing of other groups that are doing similar work across the United States would be another great sort of way to share and exchange these stories across these artificial borders, right? And to validate those stories as well. So I think that that's a really important part of the way in which you sort of, I think oppose and create counter narratives about that history.
And I was going to say, and validate it, right? Because that was the Black Lives Matter comment about listen to the narrative, understand it, and believe it. So believe that this is true. Like, we shouldn't have to show all these pictures to validate things. That this should be part of our global world history, right? So, so are there societies for community psychologists, for psychologists in general, for us to join as part of the Black Indigenous groups in Canada?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's really interesting. Part of the reason the elder that I regarded said what she said was that there has been so little mobilizing around these issues in Canada. There's been a heck of a lot more work done in the United States. So I got to say that. So for all of you who are living and residing in the United States right now, you are kind of the hub for this work. Seconded only probably by Australia, where folks who are Indigenous also consider themselves Black. And so they also work around the issues of Blackness as phenotypically Black people, but also indigeneity. And so these are the two locations and spots where these conversations are happening. But United States is central and is, in my opinion, ahead of the game in terms of having these conversations. I mean, Canada is just coming into 2020 by acknowledging systemic racism, right?
But the difference is you guys have more of a rich history that hasn't been annihilated or destroyed or discombobulated, right? So or overshadowed by enslavement, right? So I think that all of your documents, all of the rich resources need to be funneled into our U.S. story. So like I said, I'm going to connect with you outside of here so that I can get this information. Also, the terminology you're using today is super important, indigeneity and those type of things that, again, we don't have that story. We don't get to share that. And then here's the other takeaway for me from what you presented today is there's a richness in all of these cultures, including languages, ideas, vision, cultural learnings, medicinal information, all kinds of information that will be vital to us as we emerge from this pandemic and try to move forward. And so the lack of having these stories and this information is going to mean that we are going to suffer a lot longer as a people on this planet until we can incorporate all of the stories and all of the histories to fill out the richness of who we are. And I believe in those stories is the solution for COVID, is the solution for our political problems, is the solution for poverty. It's all there. Our ancestors left it for us. And because we had this colonization that annihilated it, we're left floating on this island, and we're actually really connected to a greater universe, but we have to tell the story. We have to re-access this, and we can't be ashamed or, you know, so I cannot thank you enough. I mean, I have so much gratitude for what you did and for capturing these beautiful narratives. And please, anything that I can do to help, let me know, because this is our healing solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for naming all of that. I would love to connect afterwards. So please do connect. I know that we've already exchanged emails and have been a part of a little writing group. So let's continue that. I will say as well, you know, you know, I think that there's a lot of rich possibility here. And so I hope that folks have been, you know, can take that away from this, is that, you know, all it took, and I mean, it was not simple, but I think folks just needed, you know, as you saw Carson's story going on to finish his education, what folks really needed was a space to validate themselves and feel validated and feel, you know, that they were being encouraged in an empowering way. And he went off and he did that. Right. And that was what folks were more or less looking for, is a space of validation, and how important and instrumental that is in a person's life to propel them forward. Something that he felt he could never do, he did within a span of maybe 6 months. He was also the first person, I will add, to finish his story in our workshop. So he completed his story from start to finish in our workshop within maybe 2 days. First person to do it. And he was so hesitant about participating in this project because he was worried that his literacy would be a barrier. So again, the power of arts-based media to engage people across literacy levels as well is another thing to highlight. And Samantha, you were asking about methods. That was definitely one of the key, I think, take-homes for me from this process. I will open up the floor again for any other questions, thoughts, or considerations that folks may have for others who may not have had an opportunity to speak or would like to say something or share something.
Yeah, I have a question about, and thank you for your presentation. It's so rich, so much opportunity. Do you see the opportunity in the work for addressing where this occurs, anti-Black sentiments within Indigenous communities?
So could you repeat the question? Do I think?
Is there opportunity within your work, like this project specifically and beyond, for ways in which to address anti-Black sentiments within Indigenous communities?
Yeah, so I think just in virtue of having these stories which validate and say Indigenous Black people are here, what we've had is a response. So a lot of Indigenous people have come to me to say, you know, your work is super important. My kid is biracial, but I've never thought about the history of Indigenous Black people. And that's something I need to work through. And that's something that I need to think through. I am on my own learning journey as an Indigenous person around these issues. So I've definitely had dozens of people share that sentiment. So just in virtue of sharing these stories and these narratives, and it shows the power of Indigenous methodology, storytelling. That's what we've always done, right? The power of that has been really instrumental in getting people to think differently, because they're able to personalize that story to someone else and someone else's experiences. And so that has been very, very instrumental. There is an opportunity for teaching and learning here for sure. And I think that this sort of public platform, you know, that's the goal, is that it allows for that.
Thank you.
Any other comments?
Yeah, and I just have a very brief comment. Hi, and thank you. I was only able to join in on the last